good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Tasha Trahan. I'm with Unlimited Potential, and I'm honored to introduce Ronda Seifert. She has served as a maternal child health nurse for various state, county, and public health entities, as well as various nonprofit programs that serve our Arizona families. And throughout her career, she has worked to improve the health and well-being of children. She's recognized that climate change is a public health crisis, and she continues to work as a climate advocate. Rhonda has volunteered with climate advocacy organizations since 2016. She's written articles, provided presentations, and met with US representatives advocating for climate solutions. And this year, along with other concerned professionals, she began building the Arizona Health Professionals for Climate Action. It's a new state affiliate of the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health. And her remarks today represent her own views. So you want to go ahead and get started, Rhonda? That would be excellent.
Thank you, Tasha. Thank you so much. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing. Do speaker view. Okay. I'm just going to turn that off because it doesn't seem to be showing me. It's showing you. I don't know why. Turn that off. All right. So I appreciate my small elite group of attendees. As I explained, I had recent knee surgery and I wasn't sure if I was going to be ready. And so I am prepared to give this a great presentation today, but I did not get the word out. So thank you for being here. And I also want to say that the three topics I'm going to be talking about, which is kind of the climate science, the public impacts of climate change, and then solutions that I think people should be aware of, are really three large topics. And I'm going to be covering them in just under 90 minutes. And so I'm going to be leaving things out. There's more to the story. And then I also am going to ask that we hold questions till later, just so I can get through the material, and then we'll have a Q&A if people have any questions. So let's get going. So hopefully this recording too will be helpful to others to learn more about how climate change is impacting children. So who am I and why is this important to me? As Tasha shared, I am a public health nurse, and I care about, my experience is with maternal and child health, and so a lot of the health impacts, I'm going to focus in on children. But I'm also a mother, and these are my two sons and my husband, and we love to go to national parks, and we just hiked up from the bottom of Yosemite. And we also travel north to see my family frequently. And one of the things I kept seeing on that drive in the early 2000s were dead pine trees. And each time we went, I saw more of them, and I was really concerned about what was going on. And when I looked into it, I realized that climate change was impacting these trees. The higher temperatures and the drought was causing them to have less water, and the way trees protect themselves from pests like bark beetles is to run sap. So they were having to choose between protecting themselves or holding on to their water. And on the other side, the bark beetles, climate change also impacts their reproduction. And so they're not dying off in the winter. They have shorter reproductive cycles. And I'm going to talk about more issues with pests and vectors later in the talk. But suffice to say, the trees are stressed and vulnerable, and the pests that attack them are becoming really prolific. So I knew that it was impacting our environment. But what I also started to learn as I joined Citizens Climate Lobby in 2016, where I learned more about the science, more about how to talk to my representatives, write letters to the editor. They're a really great organization for helping you to learn more and to advocate. But what I also was given by my mentor in 2016 was this report on the impacts of climate change in human health. And it was then that I realized that climate change wasn't just impacting our environment, it's impacting us, and it's not impacting us equally. This is my 8th grade class. This is me and my pink and white shirt. I grew up in a low-income, predominantly Hispanic neighbor community. And what that report helped me recognize is that communities like the one I grew up in, we're all being impacted by climate change, but these communities are getting hit first and worse. So I have since then watched tons of webinars, read tons of reports, and continue to learn. But I also just recently, the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, we are starting a state organization here in Arizona, a state affiliate of health professionals. And so part of that work is to try to help more people understand the impacts of climate change. So I'm going to start. The first section is climate science basics. It's important that we all understand kind of what the basics of it is. And you can really summarize the basics in 10 words. It's real, it's us, experts agree, it's bad, there's hope. And I'm going to talk about these different aspects throughout the course of this presentation. So it's real. If we had a little more time, I would show this video, but it's in here and I'm going to be sending these out so you can watch it. It's about a 4-minute video and it shows one month of last summer climate disasters. It was between June and July. And it's 4 minutes of floods and wildfires and severe weather events. We are worldwide seeing these impacts. These are all Arizona. But these things that are happening here, if you're paying attention, they're happening everywhere. And it's really important to understand that sometimes you hear, well, we've always had droughts, we've always had wildfires, and this is true. But what is really important to understand is climate change is a threat multiplier. So we're not just having droughts, we're having the worst drought, mega drought, that we've had as long as our historical records go back 1,200 years. Each year we're having more severe and longer wildfire seasons, the biggest fire California's ever had, the biggest fire Colorado's ever had, flooding, et cetera. It's a threat multiplier. The next part is it's us, it's humans. We are doing this. And I will tell you, there was debate about this some decades ago. Are these natural cycles? And there are natural cycles. But what is happening right now is not a natural cycle. This is the CO2 levels at our observatory in Mauna Loa. And the last time the atmosphere held similar amounts of carbon dioxide was over 4 million years ago. And at that time, sea levels were 78 feet higher. The planet was much hotter. Modern humans have never seen these levels of CO2, and it is accelerating the rate of CO2 in our atmosphere. We're now at about 421. We're also accelerating in methane. Methane is another. I'm talking here about two of the big heavy hitters in terms of greenhouse gases that really hold heat. Carbon dioxide doesn't hold as much heat, but it lasts for hundreds to thousands of years in our atmosphere. Methane doesn't last as long, maybe about 12 years, but it holds like 80 times the amount of heat that CO2. So these are the heavy hitters, and they are both accelerating in the amount in our atmosphere. You can see here annual increases, and they are accelerating. It's even more obvious when you take those short-term graphs and you look back historically, as far back as some of our ice core measurements can go. This is natural carbon dioxide cycling. This is human-caused carbon dioxide. Not only is it at a level we've never seen, it's the acceleration, how rapidly it's increasing, we have never seen. Now, what are some of those sources? This is just to briefly give you an idea. How are we contributing greenhouse gases? There's these different areas. Our electricity production, food, agriculture, and land use contributes. Industry, the things we make, steel, et cetera. Transportation, how we move all the goods around the planet with ships and airplanes and trucks, and then our own cars. Buildings, heating them, cooling them, et cetera. And then there's a 10% of other. So our CO2 and methane is going up fast. Why does that matter? Well, we have an atmosphere that when the sun's heat comes, if without that greenhouse, some greenhouse gases, that heat would quickly bounce right back out into space and we would not be able to live on this planet. What is happening though is we are getting more and more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and what they do is they kind of act like in a pinball machine, those little bumpers where the ball's hitting around, racking up points or racking up temperature. I also think of it as a car with its windows down. It doesn't hold on to as much heat. You roll those windows up and it gets hotter and hotter and hotter because heat gets in and it can't escape. And that is what is happening on our planet. There's another picture of it, the CO2, water, and methane, because yes, water is also a heat trapping gas, and higher temperature atmosphere actually holds more water. So not only is it increasing, the other greenhouse gases are increasing the amount of water, but then that's also increasing our temperatures. I'm not going to watch it, but this is a very simple 7th grade science experiment that you can do just to show that CO2 increases temperature. So you have 2 plastic bottles, and one of them we're going to pump CO2 into it, and inside each is a thermometer, and then these are 2 lamps, heat lamps, and you heat those up, and the temperature in the one with CO2 goes up faster and it stays higher. It's simple science. We can also look at some of the other indicators. This is the sun's energy, total solar irradiance. And as you can see, it kind of cycles, but we're not seeing this huge increase here. It's doing what it's always been doing. This is our CO2 levels, and they're rapidly going up. These are our ocean heat compared to if we kind of average it over a 10-year period, kind of 1880, early days before we really started ramping up, 1880 to 1910. If we compare temperatures to that time period, they're going up, and our global surface temperatures going up. These are more graphs showing Arctic sea ice going down, spring snow decreasing, mountain glaciers melting, sea levels rising. I love and hate this particular slide. It shows multiple indicators on the same one on both the left and the right side, but it's a change in perspective on timeline. So this is a shorter timeline. You see CO2 levels increasing from 1850 to 2020, and you see it gradually going up. But when you look at it on a longer time scale of a couple thousand years, you see it's actually pretty rapid increase. So CO2 levels increasing, ocean warming increasing, sea level rising, global temperatures increasing, the troposphere, which is one of the layers in our atmosphere, increasing in temperature, Arctic sea ice melting. This is an interesting one, the cherry blossom that have been kept, the dates have been kept going back to the 1850s. When they bloom is happening earlier, and then you can see right here when you look at it over a longer period of time, it's really blooming rapidly, increasing the early time that it blooms. So we're seeing, and then humidity is increasing, and remember that is another heat trapper, and the more moisture in the air, the more extreme precipitation, snow and rain that we get. So since about the 1880s, we have seen about a global average of 1.2 degrees of Celsius. And what's really important to understand about that too is that that's an average. Lots of places, especially on land, the increases are much higher than that. So you can't think of it as, oh, well, more degree. I mean, that's not so bad. That's the average. So it's important to keep that in mind. And with that 1.2 degrees of warming Celsius, so it's 2.16 of Fahrenheit. With that warming, we're seeing unprecedented fires, hurricanes, flooding, droughts, water shortages. And at one point we thought that keeping it below 2 degrees would be good enough, but the more we're seeing impacts to our planet, the more we're realizing that 2 degrees, and when you look at the difference in lots of Earth systems between 1.5 and 2 degrees, 2 degrees is not good. And what's really terrible is we're shooting for 3 to 4 right now in our emissions. And in order, the window to try to keep it below between 1.5 and 2 is really very short. Because remember that CO2 lasts a long time in the atmosphere. And so what we're seeing is an increase, more and more billion-dollar disasters each year increasing. So when you hear people say, we can't afford to transition away from fossil fuels, we need to remember how much it's costing monetarily, but in so many other ways, the longer we delay our transition away from fossil fuels. So we're all impacted by climate change, but are we impacted equally? Well, I answered that at the beginning, we're not. And so I want you to think about, in terms of how do we know, what determines who's impacted most? And I also want, it's also a good way to think about solutions as well. How can we look at these 3 ways of decreasing harm to our communities and individuals? And really it's exposure, sensitivity, and ability to adapt. And I'm going to give you an example of each just so you kind of know what I'm talking about. Obviously, if you work outside and we have a heat event, you're going to have greater exposure. If I have asthma and there's wildfire smoke, I'm going to be more sensitive to that wildfire smoke. If we have an extra month of really hot temperatures and my budget is really just barely covering it on a normal month, I may not have the ability to adapt to those higher temperatures for that extra month. I may not be able to cool my house enough, or I may have to sacrifice something else. And so when you look at those 3 aspects, it tells us who our populations are that are experiencing greater climate harm. And you can see communities of color, low income, indigenous people, occupational groups, firefighters, agricultural workers, and et cetera. I am a maternal child health nurse, so my focus, I think a lot about children and pregnant women, and I am going to talk in general about a lot of these health impacts, but I'm going to definitely focus in and help you understand how it harms children especially. All right, experts agree. So there is scientific consensus on human-caused warming. In 2019, there was so much agreement among the models that the scientists came out to say evidence for man-made global warming hit a gold standard. It's the 5 sigma level. There's basically a 1 in a million chance humans are not warming the planet. And when you look at the literature, there's studies that look at the consensus they look at all the peer-reviewed scientific literature, and at one point it was 97%. There's even more agreement about human-caused climate change. And as you can see, these are various models from different organizations. And although, yes, there's tiny differences in their modeling, you can see the important thing is they're in agreement. We are having temperature anomalies. We're increasing in our temperatures. So if there's so much consensus, why is there doubt about the evidence? Seems like there's a lot of doubt out there still. And I think this Dilbert cartoon kind of gives you a little clue about what's going on. So Dilbert says, I invented an energy source that is cheaper than fossil fuels. And his boss says, did you also invent a way to prevent the oil-producing countries from trying to kill us for competing with them? No, toss it in the trash. So what's really going on here is we have an industry that makes trillions and trillions of dollars from selling this product, and they recognize that if they can make us doubt that their product is harmful to us, then we won't take action. And they've spent a lot of money on denial and now more recently, because climate change is so hard to deny, more of a delay campaign. And you can recognize their speaking points because they generally fall under 3 areas. They make people believe that climate action will hurt them, and in particular their pocketbooks. They make people feel like we need fossil fuels, we can't do without them. And then they try to convince us that climate change isn't such a big deal. Maybe even it's good for us. These are more links, and they're not up to date. There's even more on how the fossil fuel industry has utilized social media as well. So these are links if you're interested in. Again, that's a whole other area of that we could talk about. But suffice to say, a lot of money is going in to make it seem like the science isn't decided and that we don't need to do anything. So the experts, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, these are the top scientists in climate change and related areas all around the world who have gotten together. They review the current research and they produce reports on these various topics: knowledge on climate change, causes, potential impacts, some of our response options, special reports, and methods, and how they came about, how they put this all together. So what are the experts saying? It's bad. That's what they're saying. This is Catherine Hayhoe on LinkedIn, kind of summarizing the IPCC reports. So the work group 1 that got together, they focused on the science. It's basically the code red report. We're in trouble. Work group 2 addressed the impacts. Your house is on fire, basically. And then this more recent work group focused on the fire extinguisher manual. This is how we address this, and this is how we're doing, which I'll give you a hint, it's not great. We're not doing great. I'm going to talk about these specifics when I get to the solutions section. So climate change impacts are not some faraway future problem. They're harming us all right now, and some of us more than others. And most importantly, we need to understand it's going to get worse if we don't take rapid, urgent action. So what happens if we continue like normal or make small, slow changes? Basically, we have 3 choices in our response to climate change. We can mitigate, and that's a fancy word for reducing the gases, our greenhouse gases that are overheating our planet. Our second choice is to adapt. That's things like cooling centers, and that's reducing the impacts of climate change. And then our third option is suffer. Those are our 3 options. We can reduce our gases, we can adapt as much as we can to the impacts, and we can suffer. And the reality is the faster we reduce our emissions, the less we'll need to adapt and the less suffering there will be. That's the simple truth. And it's also really important to understand that we're not just talking about heat, although heat's pretty significant. There were eagles and other birds dropping out of the sky in India recently because of their extreme heat. Heat is no joke, but our Earth is a combination of systems, and they interact with each other like this Jenga tower. They kind of rely on each other, and we can remove pieces from the Jenga tower, and a lot of times things adapt and things are okay. But if you take the wrong piece out, and you never know for sure which one it might be, that one piece can cause the systems to tumble. And you can't just put the piece back. Once a tipping point is breached, the changes usually cannot be stopped. And so they're going to continue till to whatever point where they're going to stop on their own. So that is really important to understand. We do not want to knock the Jenga tower over. And this is more information that you can look at on your own. And I have links to all these things beneath the slides, but these are your tipping points that keep scientists and me up at night. And we are seeing some signs that some of those could be happening, or at least the start of them. All right, so that's some hard things, but that is our current situation with climate science. I hope that's helpful. I'm now going to talk about climate and health, how our health is impacted. And so I've used the CDC slide for quite a while. It shows in the center the rising CO2 greenhouse gases impacting our temperatures and extreme weather and rising sea levels. And then you see kind of other environmental impacts, environmental degradation, water and food supply impacts, et cetera. And then on the outside is how it impacts human health. So I like that one, but recently when I joined the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, they have some patient handouts, and I really like, they have one on the health impacts, and they use this acronym heat wave, and I really like it. I do switch the A's, and I talk not just about water and foodborne illnesses, but also water and food shortages impacts, because we're really seeing those, and those are really key. So let's start talking about it. So heat illness. And a lot of these, I'm going to try to focus quite a bit on Arizona specific, parts of Arizona. So this is Phoenix, and as you can see, our temperatures have been going up with crazy 2020 here, this anomaly, or this, yeah, it's a little out of the norm. And then this is the predicted temperature rise, and it depends on our emissions. So this lighter gray is a lower emission scenario, and darker, the black is a higher emissions scenario, right? And this is our days above 110. Again, you see that increase and the crazy 2020 there. And as you can see, we're talking more than 100 days by the end of the century, more than 100 days above 110. And that doesn't happen all at once. Each year, we'll be seeing an increase in those. And why does it matter? These are some slides from a Nature Conservancy report. And it matters because when on those higher temperature days, as the temperature goes up, our ED visits go up, our inpatient visits go up, and those have costs involved. So there's cost and harm involved. And then even worse, we also see heat-related deaths increase as those temperatures go up. These are Maricopa County data, and as you can see on these extreme heat warning days in red, you can see that visits to the emergency room are also increased. They are higher on those heat warning days. And some of the ED visits on those high heat days are obviously heat illness, but also renal, that's kidney disease, mental health disorders. We'll talk about that a little more in that section on mental health. And then cardiovascular disease. So our hearts have to work really hard to cool us down. And so we see more impacts because of that. And so we're also seeing, this is for Arizona, and you can see our heat deaths just keep on going up. Even though 2021 was actually a little cooler, we still saw an increase in deaths. And our hospitalizations and ED visits are also increasing with those temperatures. Now, why are children especially vulnerable when it comes to heat? So again, we're going to think about exposure, sensitivity, and ability to adapt. Well, children play outside, so they're exposed, they're more exposed. In terms of sensitivity, their skin surface in comparison to their body mass is much larger, and so more heat is hitting their surfaces, and so they absorb more heat. They also don't sweat as effectively, and in terms of adapting, they can forget to take breaks, or they may not be as tuned into their body's signs of trouble. We see during persistent heat, we see more renal or kidney disease in children, electrolyte imbalances, and fevers. And some of these higher rates of ER visits that we see on children on hotter days, there's a variety of issues that they're being seen for. Yes, heat related, but we also see GI infections, ear infections, infectious and parasitic disease, nervous system diseases. And a lot of these infection related, issues are because higher temperatures, bacteria, they reproduce more rapidly. Their water and other other issues with bacteria we see it grow more rapidly in higher temperatures. So we see that in our ER visits. And then I also want to talk about prenatally. So when pregnant women experience high heat during some of those key times when, you know, their baby's hearts are developing or other key organs, we will see an increase in heart defects. And we see as well in women who are pregnant during higher heat periods, they have more preterm labor, more small for gestational age, and more stillbirths. And in terms of some of these impacts, it's kind of hard to separate between heat and air quality because they go hand in hand. Because the warmer it is, the more ozone is produced and some of the other pollutants. But we do see that correlation. As well, poverty is an issue for children. And these are, again, the Nature Conservancy have these, I got these slides from them, and it shows tree canopy. So the darker green here on this left mini slide is tree canopy. And when you look at it over here, this is heat, darker red is high heat. And as you can see, wherever there's a higher tree canopy, you see less heat. And when you look at the child poverty rate, the darker is more poverty. You see that children tend to live in poor neighborhoods with higher heat and not in these places in the wealthier neighborhoods that have nice tree canopy. So some of the things that have contributed to these differences, some of the redlining, historic redlining, where certain neighborhoods weren't, usually communities of color weren't able to buy their houses, and were lots of other unfair policies and practices over the years and even recently is impacting children. And so children in poverty, more than 10 million in the US live in poverty, 1 in 7 overall, but 1 in 5 children of color live in poverty, 1 in 4 Black children, 1 in 5 Hispanic, 1 in 5 American Indian, in comparison to 1 in 12 white, 1 in 14 Asian. There's also something called energy insecurity, and that's basically where families or households are having to choose between heat or eat. Are they going to cool themselves from the heat, or are they going to buy food? And again, that some of those redlining and racist policies play a role. These are neighborhoods that are experiencing a greater heat island because they have a lot of asphalt and sidewalks and not a lot of green. They live in poorly insulated homes that allow a lot more heat in and out and cool out. And so their energy costs per square foot are much higher than wealthier neighborhoods. And then the percentage of their budget that goes to energy is much higher. So we see children in these families can really struggle. And when we talk about the energy insecurity, it's not just hot, it can mean death. And so this is information from Maricopa County for 2021. There were 67 indoor deaths, and there was 7 of those, they did not have air conditioning. This is Maricopa County. Everyone should have air conditioning pretty much in Maricopa County. And of those who had an air conditioning present, 42 were broken, 3 they didn't have electricity, and 12 they had them, they were working, but they weren't in use. What that tells me is, in all likelihood, these people died because they couldn't afford to fix their air conditioning, or they couldn't afford to get it fixed. So this is energy insecurity can be fatal. And when you look at the neighborhoods in Maricopa County where these higher number of deaths happen, you see these 3 inner city, all higher communities of color, 85009, that's where I grew up, very poor, predominantly Hispanic. And then you have our elderly populations in Sun City, and this is also a high senior citizen zip code in Mesa. So our low-income communities are dying because they're poor. Exacerbating heart and lung conditions, so heat wave, that's the E. So how does climate change exacerbate heart and lung issues? Well, burning fossil fuels itself has a lot of pollutants in it, and all these pollutants and more have health impacts. As well, the CO2 and methane components increase our global temperatures, and that in turn impacts our environment. When we talk about ozone, ozone is higher, the production of ozone is speeded up in higher temperatures. And so these neighborhoods, especially that can be as much as 14 degrees warmer at night, these low-income communities of color have higher ozone production as well. And ozone exposure is like a sunburn to the lungs, and we see both short and long-term impacts. Short-term, it can exacerbate asthma and it can make the lungs more vulnerable to respiratory infection, and we saw some of those impacts with COVID in low-income communities. Susceptibility, it's not just COVID, it's flu, any of those things. Some of those things, the lungs just aren't able to protect themselves as well when they have damage from some of these pollutants. And then long-term exposure, it also appears to harm cardiovascular system. And then climate change also impacts our air quality because of its impacts on the length and severity of wildfires. Those higher temperatures really suck out a lot more of the water out of our rivers and out of the water that would normally go to the rivers, where it's causing longer, more extreme droughts and overall drier conditions in the vegetation, et cetera. It's increasing those damaging pests like bark beetle, and I'll talk a little more about how it does that in the vector section. But suffice to say, it's creating a longer, more severe wildfire, especially here in the Southwest, including Arizona. And smoke inhalation causes asthma exacerbations and cardiovascular events like heart attacks and strokes. And in terms of children, one study showed as much as 10 times more harmful to children's lung health. And it's in particularly more severe for children 0 to 5 years of age. It also, climate change is impacting drought, and drought means a lot more dead plants. On my trip to LA recently, a lot of the plants that used to be out there in the desert are gone. And farmers may allow fields to be fallow or to die off because they don't have water for them. And what happens is as those dry out and the soil dies and dries, you get dust particles, and those become airborne allergens as well. So that also contributes to respiratory and cardiovascular issues. And then that poverty aspect for air quality, those hotter neighborhoods where there's more polluting industry, more power plants, more highways, more truck routes, they're more likely to walk and wait along roadways for public transportation. And then they're more likely to use alternative indoor heat. Things like we use the gas oven to heat our home at night. Some use coal, some use wood burning, and those create higher indoor pollution. So they're getting a double whammy of indoor pollution and outdoor pollution. And that wildfire smoke, as I said, it has respiratory impacts, especially asthma exacerbation, but it also impacts cardiovascular. And so we see those greater emergency and hospital admissions. Now, climate change, what's really bad is it can be this combo case. And I'm just going to give you an example. If you have a pregnant woman and she's grown up in this poor neighborhood and with this terrible air quality, and so she has asthma. And now she's got increased blood volume for her and the baby to bring oxygen and nutrients. And she doesn't have a car, so she uses public transportation. So she's needing to walk to the bus, to the bus stop. And now when you add a heat wave or high heat warning day, her heart is having to work a lot harder to cool off her body. Heat can also be a trigger for asthma. Maybe it's a drought, and we've got drought and we've got blowing wind and dust that exacerbates her asthma. Or maybe it's the allergies, and we're going to talk about how climate impacts allergies. But so she's getting triggered with allergies, and that's impacting her ability to get good oxygen in. Or maybe there's wildfire smoke in the area. Or even worse, maybe all of those things are happening all at once. And you can see that this is a mom and baby who are in deep trouble, right? So again, why are children especially vulnerable? Well, exposure, they play outside. They take more breaths per minute, so they're inhaling more of those pollutants. Their lungs are developing, so they can be damaged more easily and never get to the capacity that they would have without that damage. And then there's also the prenatal vulnerability. We see increased preterm labor, small for gestational age, and stillbirths with increased air pollution. And this is a really strong natural experiment where they took 8 coal and oil power plants in California offline, shut them down. And the 10 years following that closure, the rate of preterm births in the neighboring communities dropped 27%. So clean air really makes a difference in preterm labor. So let's talk about allergies. So what is the connection with climate change? Well, we have warmer winters, so the allergenic plants that used to kind of die off and have to start all over, they're not dying off in the winter. They also, so that season is much longer. It's starting earlier in the spring, lasting longer into the fall, and some places it's year round. As well, that increase in CO2 and temperature actually, we know, increases the pollen count per plant, and that's continuing to increase. And we're talking thousands of times more pollen in these warmer temperatures and CO2 levels. It also, the allergenic content, and that's the ability of that particle to cause allergic reaction, is higher as well. And then with drier conditions plus sometimes extreme rainfall, we can see those pollen particles get broken down into smaller particles, and then they can become airborne and inhaled deeper into the lungs, causing more systemic issues. And when you combine allergies and air pollution, it's really a 1-2 punch. Love bees, love their little lake sacs. Pollen's a great thing for our bees, but it is not great for anyone who has asthma or allergies. And air pollution actually causes higher levels of allergens. It's increasing those allergens, and it also appears to increase reactivity to the allergens. We're kind of getting this soup on these particles where it's got toxins, toxic pollutants, and things that we're allergic to, and the two together seem to really increase the reactivity to it. So we're increasing both exposure and sensitivity. So again, why are children especially vulnerable? Exposure, they play outside, their lungs are developing, they take more breaths per minute, and those living in poverty are more likely to be sensitized to allergens because of pollution impacts. All right, so traumatic injuries. Weather is crazy. Yeah, the weather. So we can all see the changes that are happening, and climate change is definitely impacting disasters. We're seeing it increases the severity and length of wildfires, seasons, severity of hurricanes, and they develop more rapidly as well, which gives much less time to prepare and take defensive action. It increases the amount of precipitation that falls all at once. Many places are getting 500-year floods every couple of years, or getting their whole year's worth of rainfall in a few hours. severity and length of droughts, we're seeing mega droughts, strength of tornadoes. It doesn't seem like it's increasing the number of tornadoes, but it does seem to be increasing the strength and maybe some clustering of tornadoes. But it's also interestingly shifting where they're happening more to the east. And the problem with that is those are communities that aren't as ready, as tornado ready as the traditional areas where tornadoes have been hitting. And then the severity of heat waves. Some of the warming of the poles mean that the jet stream that usually would be strongly running across the US, separating that really cold region from the warmer region, because the upper northern regions are warming, that jet stream is slowing down and becoming more wavy. And so some things like heat domes and hurricanes, like what we saw Harvey and Houston, they can sit there for a long time as well. And that can, some of these storms are have more extreme impacts because they're sitting there and not moving out. And then weather extremes, going from really high temperatures one day and then snow the next, that makes it really hard. And that also makes it hard when you're growing crops as well. That's a really key factor as well. So we're seeing these increase in billion-dollar disasters each year. And each one of those, I think it's important to understand, though they represent communities and individuals who have lost homes, lost maybe their farms, their houses, their family members. And so there is a lot of trauma happening with this, and I'll be talking about that more in a moment. But why are children especially vulnerable? Well, they're young. That means they have more years ahead with these increasing climate disasters and other impacts to look forward to, right? They rely on adults to keep them safe. They are dependent on someone else to keep them safe. If there is a loss of home and the way their parents earn their living, that can result in additional vulnerabilities for children, especially girls. So like in Bangladesh, where there's been a lot of flooding, a huge number of those kids they're not returning to school. They have to work to help support their families. The girls are sometimes, in many places are given early in marriage because of some of their families are now vulnerable and struggling. And you see an increased risk for domestic violence and exploitation of children. And many times children may be separated from their parents or lose a parent. And for example, after Hurricane Katrina, there were more than 5,000 children separated from their families, and it took almost 6 months to reunite the last child. The next letter of heat wave is the W, water and food-related illness. And so climate change, it increases that heavy rainfall. It increases, because of sea level rise, it increases storm surges. It's increasing water temperatures, and that can impact lots of things that can grow better in those warmer temperatures. There's more flooding, and that means more runoff, like from farms, where we can have more sewage contamination, but we can also have more chemical contamination, fertilizers, pesticides, and other, things that get flooded out. And then we have disease agents, bacteria, viruses, algae that can increase because of climate change impacts. And we can be exposed by ingestion, taking it inside our bodies, inhalation, breathing it in, skin contact, or eating something that's contaminated like fish and shellfish. And here is a beach, there's sewage contamination, so it's closed. We see, places like Florida are especially experiencing these red tides, and that's where the high temperatures and flooding have brought a lot of fertilizer and pesticides into these water areas and other contaminants, and that warmer temperature as well means a really rapid growth of algae, and algae has toxins. So they're really toxin, and they also use up a lot of oxygen as that overgrowth takes the oxygen out of the water, and so now you have dead zones in waterways and in our oceans. And this disturbs marine food webs, and it's harmful to humans, animals, and our environment. Now, when it comes to our food supply, we're also seeing major impacts here. As temperatures and precipitation extremes, like flooding, that can increase pathogen loads. It can alter weed, insects, and fungal populations, and so we can see more pesticides being used, and that's especially not good for our littlest ones because they can be hormone mimickers, and so with growing bodies, that can be more of a problem. And then you have, with rising CO2 levels, that influences the nutritional content of food. Sometimes the plants do grow faster, but they have less time to get the nutrients in there, and so they're less nutritious, and what we find is they have lower protein, iron, and zinc in major crops like wheat, rice, and barley, and these are critical. And in places where they're just barely getting enough, now they can get that same amount and still be more nutritionally vulnerable because there's less nutrients in the food they're eating. Warmer temperatures can result in food spoilage as well. So we're seeing more frequent food contamination, salmonella and some of those things. There's more places along that food delivery chain where the higher temperatures can cause bacterial growth and things like that contaminate our food. And then it can also, climate change can disrupt food distribution. So just getting it to the places where it needs to go, it can spoil before it gets there. And if you remember from that slide, we're seeing less spring snow and melting glaciers, and these are critical water sources for crops. And we're also seeing a change in precipitation normals. So as you can see here, I know I'm getting allergies right now. As you can see here, Arizona is definitely an area seeing decreased precipitation, and I'm sure we're all very much aware of the Colorado River and the drought that we're experiencing, not just the Colorado River, and that's happening in many places around the planet, that kind of drought situation. And it's also important to know that this region in here is it grows about 90% of the US winter vegetables. So these areas, not just here, but in many other places that have been growing our food, are now experiencing things like drought, temperature extremes, both high and low, and shift in rainfall and flooding and more pests and things like coffee or hops that have a very particular environment that they need, or particular precipitation, and when they're struggling. And so we're seeing definite impacts to our crops. Again, that higher temperatures and erratic rainfall or declining really harms our crops. And healthy plants, when they're unhealthy, they're less able to fight off disease. They're weaker, more vulnerable, less productive. And especially temperatures at night when they're warm, they're not resting, they're not able to grow, they're having to regulate their temperature instead. So we see these wetter, warmer, drier climates impacting their life cycle and their distribution and how well they're doing. And look closely at this wheat here. This is the cover of the May 21st, The Economist. And we've already been seeing some of these things I just talked about, climate change impacts, and then COVID-19 created some supply chain issues as well. And now the war in Ukraine, which Ukraine is a top supplier of wheat worldwide. And so between Russia and Ukraine, that's 12% of traded calories. And then you add the extreme heat wave that India has been experiencing, and they're the second largest global wheat supplier. And we're going to see food supply issues. We also see marine food web impacts. Just today, I saw an article about New Zealand, their largest salmon producer that produces about 85% of the salmon worldwide. Their largest company has lost 42% of their fish and are having to close some of their salmon farms because it's just the ocean's too warm. And the acidification is also impacting that food web. So we're talking about a lot of food and water being impacted by climate change. So why are children especially vulnerable? Well, they're more vulnerable because they have immature immune systems in those early ages. And so they're more likely to get sick and not do well. They're also more vulnerable when there's water or food shortages. And in a famine situation, which is defined 1 death per 5,000 each day, normally half of those will be children 0 to 5. And asthma, I'm feeling depressed right now. Sorry, I know it's hard. I just think it's important to really understand how much children are impacted. So, sorry, I paused on this. So we don't want children smoking. We don't recommend that women smoke during pregnancy, and this is a fake ad. And yet, our air quality, we're okay with our air quality, which we know harms our respiratory and our cardiovascular system and impacts children, and both prenatally and once they're out. Yet we're okay with that. So we have many counties with F grades. Phoenix is the 5th smoggiest city, 8th for year-round foot. It's just not acceptable. And then when you look at poverty, we see that our low-income families, for adults and children, they have much higher rates of emergency visits in the past year due to asthma and hospitalizations as well. And that's because our low-income communities have a lot more pollution. And that's from historic redlining, ongoing unfair housing, education, and investing policies. There's just more pollution. They're more likely to live near those major roadways, take public transportation, and some of the things I've already talked about, and also indoor allergens like mites, molds, cockroaches, and other pests. They just have poorly built homes that are more likely to have some of these issues. Mold in particular, from some, again, climate change can cause more flooding. And so afterwards, there can be a lot of mold in these homes. And again, children are more vulnerable because they breathe faster, take in more soot, pollution, dust, pollen. They're more likely to live in poverty. They're more likely they play outside, and they have developing lungs. So my question here is, what creature kills more humans than any other? Give you a second to think. And it's the mosquito. So we're going to talk about now vector-borne diseases. And what vectors are, it's a fancy word, just they're small organisms like mosquitoes, sandflies, ticks, fleas that can carry serious disease. So in order to have disease transmission, pathogen transmission, you have to have a host. That would be us or some other reservoir animal like birds or bats, etc. And then you need a vector, and that would be the tick, the mosquito, the flea, and then they have to be carrying a pathogen like malaria, West Nile virus, dengue. When you have all 3 of those, then you have disease transmission. So these are some of the major vector-borne diseases, and West Nile is the most common disease in the US, and Arizona has had a high number of West Nile. Lyme disease is also one that is increasing across the US, and these are some others as well. Some of them aren't, malaria, Zika aren't really happening in the US, but they're happening elsewhere. And why does climate change impact vector-borne diseases? Well, I'm going to talk quite a bit of mosquitoes because they are the major carrier and transmitter of disease to humans. How frequently they feed is impacted by higher temperatures. The mosquito infection rate, how likely they are to infect, the transmission, their ability to transmit that disease, the parasite itself, how quickly it develops inside the vector, inside the host. The adult mosquitoes' mortality rate, they last longer in warmer temperatures. How many eggs they lay daily is higher in higher temperatures. How many of those eggs survive to adulthood is higher. Mosquitoes' reproductive development rate, how quickly they go from being an egg to an adult able to reproduce, is much shorter in warmer temperatures. And then they have a longer reproductive season. It starts early because it's warmer. It starts earlier and ends later. So all of that equates to a lot more mosquitoes and other vectors. And so we're seeing an increase in tick-borne and mosquito-borne diseases in the US going up, and and then Lyme disease is also increasing. And we know it's largely unreported. Most people don't have the kind of symptoms where they are recognized that they have Lyme disease, and so a lot of it is estimated, but it's increasing, as you can see, because it's moving into new areas. And this is something else to kind of understand, that, so it's a complex relationship between temperature. So these are, each one of these are a type of mosquito, and this is the disease that type of mosquito tends to carry. So this is Eastern equine encephalitis virus, West Nile virus, dengue, Zika. Different mosquitoes carry different disease, and they also tend to like different temperatures. And so each one of these represent a different mosquito. And so when it's too cold for all of them, you're not going to see a lot of mosquitoes. If it's too warm, you're not going to see a lot. But as temperatures go up, the type of mosquito that's doing well in an area might change, and with it, the disease that is more common in that area, because they carry different diseases. So what we end up seeing then is movement of vectors into new environments. We're seeing ticks move into new environments, and we might see a change in mosquito type. So a different type is doing well now with this higher temperature. And so what that means is maybe the disease that's the most common in an area might shift from being malaria to dengue. And that also means there's less immunity in those new areas. And the healthcare providers may not be aware, they may not be as familiar with that new disease, and they may not identify it, they may not recognize what is happening. As well, how we prevent those infections may no longer be effective. So if we're in an area that has been experiencing malaria because we have the Anopheles mosquito, and now our temperatures are higher, and we're now seeing Aedes aegypti, who carries dengue. If we try to use the bed nets at night to protect us from nighttime biters, that's not going to help us with these daytime biting Aedes aegypti, okay? So it also impacts our prevention measures. So these changes in habitat can mean kind of changes in the interactions between humans, the animal hosts, and vectors. It can bring more of them closer together, some of these changes in habitat. Flooding can produce more breeding opportunities. For some mosquitoes love plastic containers. After a flood, they can be breeding grounds for certain types of mosquitoes. In a drought, that can also actually increase mosquitoes, certain types, because people tend to store water in containers that can then become breeding grounds for vectors. As well, lakes and rivers become more stagnant, or what we call stinky water. And that kind of environment, the mosquito eggs don't get washed away, and then we see way more mosquitoes, certain types of mosquitoes in those areas. As well, deforestation, or change in land use, is strongly correlated with an increase in the concentration of mosquitoes capable of carrying human pathogens. You know, if we leave the forest intact, that's where they want to live. They're going to stay there. But when we take it down, we force both animals and vectors to move in and try to find new sources of nutrition. So it's also, climate change is impacting other zoonotic diseases. So vector-borne diseases are just one of the animal to human, that's what zoonotic means, one of the types of zoonotic. There's also airborne, waterborne disease, and proximity to and direct contact with animals or foodborne are some of the ways that we can get exposed to those. And when you look at some of the zoonotic diseases and death rates, you can see, you know, they can be pretty significant. And obviously, our most recent zoonotic disease, COVID, coronavirus, has really had a huge toll, over 1 million in the US and over 6 million worldwide. So And it's important to understand that some of the changes that we're seeing that humans are doing are going to increase our risk for those zoonotic diseases. So taking down trees, removing trees is a double dose of pandemic risk because it accelerates the rise of carbon concentrations, which increases warming. And then it also removes refuges. I don't know why that one, it sounds weird, sorry. You know what I mean, for wildlife. It removes a place where wildlife are safe. And stressed animals are more susceptible to becoming hosts, and they can provide a place where those pathogens can mutate and evolve into something more dangerous for humans. And again, children. So pregnancy is a critical development period for the brain and other organs. So when those viruses can really cause harm if it's during one of those critical development periods. Children in general spend, again, more time outdoors, closer to the ground where vectors are. They have reduced immune system capabilities that sometimes plays a role. And, you know, when there's infectious diseases like COVID, another way that they're impacted is when we're trying to protect them, they may lose access to education and social interactions. And then as well, and we have definitely seen this with COVID, we see many children who have lost parents or grandparents, and those are long-term, both financially and most definitely emotional impacts for children that last a lifetime. And so, you know, with that transition, emotional stress is also a factor. That's our last letter of heat wave. So, you know, individuals can have individual vulnerabilities, social and physical vulnerabilities that make them more susceptible to physical health impacts that we're talking about, also mental health impacts. So depression, stress, and anxiety about climate change or about, you know, some of these disasters. They can have post-traumatic stress disorder after disasters. We also see community health impacts, you know, loss of community cohesion, some increased personal aggression, social instability. And so we're seeing with climate change kind of some ongoing anxiety and depression for a lot of people about climate change. And then we see, you know, after disasters, we see acute traumatic experiences during and after. And then if families are forced to leave the place where they've been living, that means a loss of homes, communities, family members, even their identity. And when a farmer loses their land and has to migrate to the city, is he still a farmer? He or she, are they still a farmer if they don't have a farm anymore? And then a shift in roles and feeling of value. So they may have felt like a productive member of society, and now they're feeling like a burden. And then there's lots of experiences of racism and discrimination, especially if they're having to migrate to another country. And so as well, higher temperatures correlate with more aggression, conflict, and violence, and also interestingly, a higher suicide rate. We see a strong correlation with that with higher temperatures. And those with existing mental and physical health diagnoses, stress is a trigger for mental health conditions and physical health. And then some of the medications that individuals take, especially for mental health conditions, they can affect the person's ability to regulate their temperature. And we know that mental health diagnoses are often correlate with poverty, so they have all those additional risk factors because of poverty. And again, those disasters are increasing, so we're going to continue to see increase in the mental health impacts. And again, why are children more vulnerable? Well, they don't always understand why difficult things are happening. They rely on the adults around them, and it's frightening if they don't know that that person can keep them safe. They can lose education opportunities. Abuse is higher when families are struggling financially, and there can be more exploitation, even human trafficking. And then sometimes loss of parent suicide after flooding and extreme drought. We see suicide among farmers as an example. And this is a youth survey of 10,000 youth aged 16 to 24, and in 10 countries, including the US, 76 feel frightened about the future, hesitant to have children, 39%, and just feel like we failed them. All right, so I have gone a little longer on my time, so I'm going to try to get through here. Again, we can mitigate, adapt, or suffer, and so there is hope. And what's really great is climate solutions are often health solutions. They're good for us. And so I'm going to talk about both individual or household actions and then more systemic actions. So as individuals, we can do things that can help. We can cut our food waste, eat a more plant-based diet, switch our energy if we can. Obviously, we can't all afford it. And so that's more the policy side, making these choices the easier, less costly choice, right? Insulating home, saving LED lights, heating and cooling smarter with heat pumps and smart thermostats, getting solar if we can, driving electric if we can, getting around greener, more walking, biking, flying less, reducing and recycling. And this slide will kind of show you that there's some things like reducing food waste and plant-rich diets that are pretty impactful. But Catherine Hayhoe says the most important thing we can do is talk about it, and I agree. With our friends, family, colleagues, our employers, our representatives, and you can share what you're doing and why you're excited about that, and really let them know that climate change matters to all of us, and ask them to take action. And there's a great little TED Talk that kind of helps with how we should talk about it. And number one, we should use plain, obvious, universal language that helps others understand why it matters to them. And again, if you've ever tried to quit plastic, individual choice helps, but we need system change to really make a difference. We can't do it individually when the systems are working against. So if we don't want to have a pretend happy future Earth Day, we've got to really make some system changes. And so one of the things that I highly recommend is join a climate advocacy group. Many of you are part of one already, and there's lots of choices. This article has other choices. And if you're a health professional, please join us at Arizona Health Professionals for Climate Action. So some of the systemic, this is Catherine Hayhoe's summary of what the recommended actions are. It's basically build massive amounts of renewables, electrify everything, conserve and really increase our energy efficiency, research the things that we don't yet have solved, how we can get away from fossil fuels for those, and then invest in nature. Nature can really sequester a lot of carbon and reduce some of our emissions. And these are some of my favorites. You might not think about it, but supporting breastfeeding. One of the reasons it's something that I think is important is it's a safe, clean food and liquid source. It's not vulnerable to supply chain or disasters. It's additional calories for toddlers if there's food scarcity. It provides immunological the mom's adult immune protection to their child, and that's especially important if they're living in crowded refugee conditions. It provides natural child spacing, so it can help reduce the number of children, which is an important thing that we do need to do. It can decrease the risk for abuse and neglect. Some of those hormones that moms produce really are nurturing hormones when they're for breastfeeding. And it can decrease the risk for SIDS, which might be even more critical if the sleeping conditions aren't exactly what we would like to have. And then there's many other benefits for both. And so there's things we can do, especially in healthcare, to make sure we're supporting moms that want to breastfeed, making sure they get the support they need, the time to pump if they're returning to work, and having a diverse lactation workforce is also really key, and supporting that to make that happen. The next solution that I advocate for is carbon fee and dividend. There's really brilliant people who say that this is one of the quickest, best ways we can reduce our carbon emissions. And this is a Canadian little info sheet. So your check would not go to citizens of Canada, it could to US, but I liked their infographic. You basically make the cost higher, but you return that to family households. And what that drives is people to make smarter choices, less carbon intensive choices, and businesses create market solutions that decrease carbon as well, help us all to decrease carbon. And that can decrease by itself 50%. So we'll have to do other things, but it also builds jobs, reduces death, and it's most important. One of the really key things for me is it's especially beneficial for low-income households. It protects them from those higher costs of the carbon. And it's mentioned by IPCC. This is Vote ER. It's a way to increase voter registration in our ERs. It's nonpartisan. We just need more people to be civically active. Community choice aggregation. I love this solution. It's basically taking the utilities and just keeping them with delivering the energy and maintaining the lines. And we separate out the buying and building of electricity supply. And what it's found to do is bring more affordable, locally controlled and clean energy to customers at a much more quickly. Community solar, not everybody can have rooftop solar. So this will allow, community solar is a way of allowing individuals to share in solar panels and get the benefits, reduce their energy insecurity, and have more people benefit from clean energy. And then Community Solar Plus, I love because it focuses in on our vulnerable communities, accelerates investment there, and helps evolve the grid and make it more equitable. It includes covering parking with solar panels, kind of reducing urban heat island impacts. And this is just kind of a drawing that kind of represents some of that. And it can help our key institutions like hospitals to also have some energy independence that is protective during blackouts. I love green banks. It combines private and public funding to help accelerate investment in clean energy products. And it tends to, for every $1 that the green bank contributes, tends to bring in another $2.4, and they accelerate investments in clean technology and reduce carbon. This is regenerative agriculture, which is really indigenous knowledge that the way they've been planning all along. But you can see our modern agriculture really destroys the soil and contributes to terrible runoff in our rivers of pesticides and chemicals. And then on this side, you have biodiversity. You're protecting the soils. And they're able to sequester far more carbon and more water, so it protects against flooding as well. And this is, ASU has done some videos on some of the farmers, carbon cowboys, doing that kind of regenerative, and you can watch on this link here, carboncowboys.org. So finding solutions for everyone, and again, protecting our forests, these things are beautiful, they're good for our health, they're good for our water, our air. There are a lot of really great solutions out there. And these are a few more ideas and so another article. And then the rest is a section for healthcare professionals. That's all on our website. And it's basically what health professionals can do, which is basically get more educated, speak out, take a role, especially in decarbonizing the healthcare sector. And they can join our organization to learn more and do that and be part of that work. And all these resources are on our website, and then June 16th, Arizona along with we're supporting their panel with Dr. Brian Drummond. He's from our steering committee. He's going to be talking about air, allergies, and wildfire and how to reduce those impacts. And this is our new logo, Arizona Health Professionals for Climate Action. And I'm really sorry, I definitely went over what it was in my practice, but I'd like to see now, are there any questions? Thank you so much.
I'm checking the chat and I don't see any questions. Maybe we could input the new website into the chat box in case someone wants to grab that real quick.
Yes, that's a great idea. Thank you. Let's see. And I'll put that in the chat. Okay, what is the best way to engage more health professionals in climate action? Thanks, Sandy. That's a great question. So, I mean, that's predominantly what our organization is doing. We've seen in New Hampshire had a new state affiliate that started 9 months ago, and they have, it's like 1,200 new members have signed up in just that short 9-month period. And they have over, I think, 160 members actively working in work groups. So what I would say is, if you build it, they will come. And so we're trying to build our organization as quickly as we can. We're probably going to launch in end of July, early August. And I think health professionals are very concerned. They're seeing it, especially if they're working, like some of our ER docs, they are seeing it coming into their emergency rooms. They know it's hurting their patients and they want to help, and we just need to help them connect with organizations that can help them better do the things that we can do as health professionals. We're trusted voices, and so we can do things like write letters to the editor, op-eds. We can meet with our legislative leaders, and we're trusted voices in those places. So definitely want to see more engagement. And I'm open to if anyone else has any other ideas as well. So I think. Thanks, Sandy. I think education, I think to some degree, the other thing that our organization is doing is, yeah, thank you, engagement with hospitals, absolutely. So one of our Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, which is our parent organization, they're doing some really phenomenal work in each state affiliate is doing some really great work, and then as an organization they are. And one of the things they're working on is to get more of our top level medical authority organizations like the American Academy of Pediatrics, American Medical Association, American Nursing Association, have all of those organizations have policy statements about it and recommendations for what their members can do, because that really strengthens the ability of the provider to go ahead and take action. The other thing, I thought of something else. Oh, and then the other thing, the healthcare sector actually contributes about 9% of the US's total emissions, and it's more than many countries in the world, the US healthcare system. So we are a major industry that's doing harm, and we are to do no harm. And so there is a huge amount of work being done right now on decarbonization. And I think California is taking that group is within our organization is taking a major role, but other ones as well. And we're working with other large organizations on that. And so I hope that's one of the work groups we can have as part of our Arizona affiliate. If people are if the healthcare providers are interested in doing a decarbonization work group, then they can, that can be what they work on. And it can be little projects in a hospital system or healthcare system, or it can be major. So it can be something as simple as you talk them into doing more plant-based meals in the cafeteria. That can be one of them. Or you can get them to transition their fleet to electric vehicles. So it can be small. There are things in the OR suite is one of the high polluting areas, and there's lots of things that can be done in there, including anesthetic gases. Some can still put you under, and they don't stay. Some gases stay in the atmosphere a really long time and are very heat trapping, and other options dissipate faster and are less heat trapping. And a lot of the changes that hospitals can make can actually are money savers. So they can save money. So thank you, Sandy. Is there anything else? Anyone else? Any other questions? Well, I just really appreciate your time, all of you. I thank you for attending, and hopefully for those listening to the recording, I hope as well that it's been helpful and that you've learned something. So thank you.
Thanks, Rhonda.